I read a stat that said a 2023 study found that more than 40% of brains from contact sport players who died before age 30 had CTE, which came out of Boston University.
Yeah, that was our study last August. And in that study, we studied 152 athletes, and we found like 63 had signs of CTE, early CTE, so about 41% had CTE. That is shocking news. That is saying to me, we have to address this disease. These are kids. They had no reason for their lives to end so early. So we have to address this, even if the risk is small for high school players or college players, which I don't think is true. I think for college, it's actually quite substantial. We have to address this to keep our kids safe. Most people, most parents want their kids to live long, productive lives. And this is a disease that cuts them down, cuts down their potential early in life.
And a study done from your university as well said that 345 out of the 376 former NFL players, which is 92%, who were studied, had CTE in their brains. And how does this disease impact that person's life? Because, these children that are playing sports, whether it's, soccer or rugby or American football right now, they're probably not seeing the symptoms in their everyday life. But you're telling me that the symptoms will show up potentially if they do develop CTE. What are those symptoms? You spoke to the families, you've seen the loss of their,
So we can see symptoms quite early. We have found, in that study of the 152 young athletes, they were all symptomatic. And those symptoms generally are depression, very common, emotional lability, irritability, impulsivity, poor judgment, making poor choices. There can be aggressive and violent behaviors, physical and even verbal violence, and a short fuse, so a small infraction causes them to have sort of an exaggerated hostile response. And then you can even develop memory loss and cognitive change, even in these young athletes. In general, the symptoms develop later, maybe 4 years later, a decade later, and they generally show up again as these behavioral and mood symptoms, a personality change. And as the person gets older, they start to be memory loss, difficulty thinking, cognitive loss, and then ultimately dementia in almost everyone who has severe disease.
Can you give me some case studies that have really stood out to you as it relates to the symptoms showing up early, but also showing up in a really intense way?
Yeah, there was, we actually did a deep dive into several of the players and families that were in that 2023 paper about the young athletes. And there's a very compelling video on the New York Times website of an 18-year-old Wyatt Bramwell. What he tells you in this self-tape, he actually videotaped himself before taking his own life. And it's a very tough tape to watch.
Hello. So what this is me explaining what's wrong with me. I've been depressed for a long time. My head is pretty messed up and damaged. The voices and demons in my head just started to take over everything I wanted to do. I took a lot of hits through football. Took a lot of concussions. And a lot of times I never told anybody about how I was feeling in my head after a hit. I just kind of kept playing, which was not smart on my end. I know that. Dad, I know you're capable of doing this, and I want you to do it. After my funeral, which will be an open casket, I want my brain donated to be studied. I feel like it'll be closure for me, and it'll be closure for you guys to know that maybe Wyatt suffered from brain damage. Maybe that was the reason. So do that for yourself. I would like that to be done. I want you all to be happy that I'm free and that I can rest easy, because my life for the past 4 years has been living hell inside of my head. I love you, and goodbye.
It's the same story over and over with these young athletes. There's something wrong. They're not thinking clearly. They can't really easily put their finger on it. And if they go to seek help, a lot of times the medical professionals don't take it seriously or don't think it could possibly be related to the playing of football or other contact sports. And so they're dismissed. The symptoms are dismissed, and that also contributes to their despair and deep depression.
As you were saying that, I just pulled up an article about Wyatt, and it is heartbreaking. The article says, in July 2019, just months after graduating from high school at 18 years old, he took his own life. About a year later, researchers at your university diagnosed him with stage 2 CTE, caused by playing tackle football for several years. So did you look at his brain?
I did.
And what did you see?
I saw multiple CTE lesions in many parts of his brain. You'd think I'd get, used to it, but every time you see it in a young person, you just can't get over it. You just it stops you in your tracks. It just makes you stop everything and wonder, why aren't people doing more to prevent this disease? We now have the knowledge. We just have to take action.
Wyatt's mother suspects he knew what he was doing when he took his own life. He shot himself in the heart instead of the head. Christy Bramwell, his mother, said it was her son's dying wish to donate his brain to CTE research, and the only way to diagnose the disease is through an autopsy of the brain.
It just breaks your heart. He was desperate. And he wanted people to know. If he did seek help, I'm not sure he did, but if he had, I don't think anyone would have understood what was causing it. And this is the disconnect. We have lots of evidence that this is happening in amateur sports, especially American football, but other sports as well. And this is a disease that is entirely preventable.
If I started playing American football or some kind of sport that involved a lot of sort of head trauma when I was younger, I started playing soccer when I was, I must have been 10 years old when I started playing in a competitive team. And then I played up until I was maybe sort of 18, roughly, years old. If I carried on doing that, at what age would, in your opinion, if I was the average player, the first signs of this traumatic brain injury, the CTE, start to show? Because I'm thinking about Premier League football players in the UK, soccer players in the UK. They often start at 5 years old. They play until maybe they're 35 years old. And then what we do tend to see is we see mental health issues.
Yeah.
We often see alcoholism.
Mm-hmm. A way to cope with their mental health issues.
Yeah. And other forms of compulsive behavior. And I wondered if there was a link at all, and if it can show up as soon as their 40s.
Yes.
And then 50s.
We definitely have. We have a collegiate soccer player with CTE, the first American case of CTE in a woman. We even have a high school soccer player with early CTE. So what we don't know about soccer, because we have fewer brain donations from soccer players, we still haven't developed the dose, the years of play versus CTE that we have developed for these other sports. So that is one of the studies that we're hoping to do, is study the brains of soccer players, maybe collaborate with places like Brazil or the UK, where soccer is the predominant sport. And if these people were to die, analyze their brain, and that would enable us to develop a response, a dose response curve with the number of years played and risk for CTE.
Have you seen the UFC?
I have not.
It's like MMA.
But it's brutal, right?
It's brutal. There's also boxing. When you were talking about CTE, I thought about the term they used to say when people retired from boxing, or even when they got later in their career in boxing, they used to call it being punch drunk.
Yes. That was the original report on CTE that was actually published in 1928 in Boxers. And it described the symptoms that boxers developed if they stayed in the ring too long, and that was called punch drunk. And then later that nomenclature got changed to dementia pugilistica, because they thought it happened primarily in pugilists or boxers. And then through the years, there's slow recognition that it could happen to individuals who had other causes of hits to the head, and ultimately like American football players. But there was a circus clown that was that had a lot of hits to the head that developed CTE. So people started realizing that it's not exclusive to boxers. It's actually anyone who gets repetitive hits to the head. It was described in an older woman who was a product of domestic violence. And that's why they had to sort of make it a broader term. And that was when CTE was really accepted as a term.
And explain simply for someone like me who doesn't know anything about the brain, how does CTE develop? Like, what's going on? Is there a way to simply explain it to me?
Yeah, well, it is based on the physics of the injury, that acceleration, deceleration, the stretch of the brain. It causes the brain to be damaged in the parts of the brain that get the most stress, the most strain. So they get the most physical displacement. That's where you see the damage to the brain. And it almost always is in the frontal lobes, but at the crevices of the brain is where it starts. So we see the earliest stages at the crevices because those get the most shearing. And it also starts around blood vessels because the blood vessels have a certain viscoelastic property, and then the brain around it has another. And so there's another shearing force around the blood vessels. So the physics of the injury, the physics of the traumatic acceleration, deceleration, determine where the brain is injured first, and that's crevices and around blood vessels. And that's exactly what you see in stage 1 and stage 2 CTE.
So if I'm constantly heading the ball, I'm playing soccer, constantly heading the ball forward like this, my brain is moving forward
and backward.
And backwards.
And it's just the stretch.
And when it stretches, something is happening there. Is it like a bruising or the chemical show up to?
It's like it's a shearing force. So you have a tissue that's being stretched. The elements inside the tissue are also being stretched, and they're going to break. There's going to be damage that's caused by this sudden elongation. It's going to snap some of the fibers and injure some of the blood vessels.
So how many times have I got to head a football for that to happen?
I don't know. We aren't able. If they had accelerometers in headbands with soccer players, we might know the answer to that question, but obviously we don't. And but we do know that years of play in football is associated with risk. In fact, for every 2.6 years of American football, it doubles your risk for CTE. There's a somewhat lower risk. I can't remember exactly right now the number of years of ice hockey that you need to play to double your risk for CTE. It's somewhat lower. And rugby also has a dose-response relationship.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.